This is a true story, something that happened to me not long after I retired. It's funny how people think your life is over at that age, when really, it's just the quiet beginning of a war. The weight of the cold Ohio air felt heavier than usual that morning, settling on the new bronze plaque that bore my late husband's name, the David Vance Memorial Bridge. I was standing in the front row, the town's guest of honor, listening to Councilman Richard Sterling's voice boom through the speakers, when he smiled directly at me and publicly credited my dead husband with a crime he didn't commit. He used David's good name, his 40 years of service to our town of Westerville, to cover up a decade of his own sins, and he did it thinking a 69-year-old widow was too frail to notice. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My husband, David, was a civil engineer. Not the flashy kind who builds skyscrapers that scrape the clouds, but the kind who builds the bones of a community. For 40 years, he was the lead engineer for the Westerville Public Works Department. He designed sewer lines, managed water treatment facilities, and yes, he designed bridges. He loved this town. He believed that good, solid infrastructure was a quiet promise a town made to its citizens, a promise of safety, of reliability, of a future. David was a man of quiet integrity. His blueprints were meticulous, his calculations double and triple checked. He believed in things that last. When he passed away 2 years ago after a long, brutal fight with pancreatic cancer, it felt like the whole town had lost its foundation. Richard Sterling was supposed to be part of that foundation. David had hired him 30 years prior, a fresh-faced kid straight out of Ohio State with a charming smile and a hunger to learn. David took him under his wing. He treated Richard like the son we never had. He taught him everything, not just about load-bearing capacities and soil compaction, but about public service, about the sacred trust between a government and its people. When David got sick, Richard was a rock. He'd come by our little brick house on East Home Street with groceries, mow the lawn without being asked, and sit with David for hours, talking about old projects, letting my husband feel like he was still part of the world. After David was gone, Richard handled everything. He helped me with the probate court filings at the Franklin County Courthouse, explained the convoluted pension paperwork, and held my hand at the funeral. He was the one who stood before the town council and gave a tearful, impassioned speech arguing that the new State Street Bridge, a massive, multi-million-dollar project replacing the one David had designed in the 70s, should be named in my husband's honor. It was Richard's idea, too, to start the Westerville Community Trust. He pitched it to me and a dozen other recent retirees over coffee and donuts at the Westerville Senior Center. He said it was a way to keep David's legacy alive. David always wanted to do more for this town than the budget allowed, he'd said, his voice resonating with sincerity. This trust will allow us, his friends and neighbors, to invest directly in Westerville's future. We'll fund new park benches, beautification projects, scholarships for engineering students. Safe, local investments with a guaranteed return, and it all goes to making our home a better place. He made it sound so noble, so. David. I, along with many of my friends, moved a significant portion of our retirement savings into that trust. It felt right. It felt like we were honoring my husband and securing our own futures at the same time. Richard Sterling, by then a respected town councilman, was the sole administrator. We trusted him completely. Now, standing there at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the Ohio autumn chill creeping into my bones, that trust was turning to ice in my veins. The new bridge loomed behind him, a sleek, modern behemoth of steel and concrete. It was impressive, I suppose, but it lacked the simple, sturdy elegance of David's original design. Sterling was at the podium, his handsome, TV-friendly face projected onto a large screen for the news cameras from WSYX6. And while we honor David Vance today, he said, his voice dropping into a somber, confidential tone, we are also righting a quiet wrong. David was a good man, the best. But he was a man of his time, forced to work with limited budgets and less stringent oversight. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The truth is, the original bridge was deteriorating far faster than anyone predicted. My friend David, in his later years, confessed to me his deep regret over the necessary compromises made, the corners that had to be cut. This new bridge is not just a replacement, it's a promise of the safety and security our town deserves, a promise we are making in his memory. The lie was so slick, so perfectly delivered, it slid into the air and settled over the crowd like an indisputable fact. My David? Cut corners? The man who once made a contractor rip out and repair 100 yards of concrete because the mix had 0.5% too much water? The man who lost sleep over hairline fractures? My hands, clutching the commemorative program, began to tremble. It was a public desecration of his name, a quiet, vicious rewriting of history. And why? To justify the exorbitant cost of this new bridge? To make himself look like the town's savior? My eyes scanned the crowd of smiling faces, people nodding in solemn agreement, believing every word. They saw Richard Sterling, the devoted public servant. I was suddenly seeing a stranger. A predator who had used my grief, my trust, my husband's name, as a shield. My gaze drifted past the podium, to the small, exclusive cluster of people standing near the councilman's entourage. There were developers in expensive suits, a few lobbyists I recognized from the papers. And standing right beside them, clapping politely, was a man I hadn't seen in 15 years, Marco Rossi. Rossi was a contractor, a notorious one. David had caught him using substandard steel rebar on a municipal garage project and had him blacklisted, banned from ever bidding on a city contract again. David had called him a snake, a man who would risk lives to save $1. And there he was, looking fat and prosperous, not just at the ceremony, but in the inner circle of the man who had just slandered my husband. They caught each other's eye, Richard and Marco, and shared a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a look of shared secrets, of profitable alliances. It was the look of partners. In that instant, the cold dread in my stomach began to burn, transforming into something else, something hard and hot. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was a witness. He thought he was safe because I was old. He thought my memory was fading, my will was gone, my voice was too quiet to ever be heard. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had forgotten that I wasn't just David Vance's wife. I was a research librarian for 45 years. And I knew, better than anyone, where all the bodies were buried. I spent the next week in a fog of quiet, simmering rage. The ceremony was all over the local news and the Westerville news and public opinion. There were pictures of Richard with his arm around my shoulder, a look of profound, feigned sympathy on his face. The caption called him a pillar of the community, honoring a fallen mentor. My friends called, offering their condolences, not for David's death 2 years ago, but for the sad revelation about the old bridge. It must be so hard to hear, one of them said, but Richard is so brave for telling the truth. Each phone call was another twist of the knife. They weren't just believing the lie, they were grateful for it. They felt safer now, protected by the benevolent Councilman Sterling. I didn't correct them. I just listened, my grip on the receiver tightening until my knuckles were white. Grief is a strange, disorienting country, but this was different. This was a violation. Richard hadn't just stolen my husband's reputation, he had stolen our shared past, replacing it with a cheap, convenient forgery. My first move wasn't dramatic. It was ingrained in me by decades of habit. I went to the library. Not my old haunt, the Westerville Public Library where I could still picture the exact location of every book on every shelf, but the Franklin County Records Center downtown in Columbus. It was a sterile, impersonal place, all beige filing cabinets and the low hum of fluorescent lights. I sat at a dusty microfilm reader, the machine whirring softly as I spooled through years of town council meeting minutes. The attendants barely noticed me, just another old woman chasing down some genealogical thread. They underestimated me. Everyone did. That was going to be my greatest advantage. I started with the new bridge project. I wanted to see the proposal, the bids, the budget allocation. Richard had made it his signature issue, his crusade for Westerville's safety. The initial proposal was from 5 years ago, while David was still alive, though already sick. The estimated cost was $12 million. A lot of money, but within reason for a project of that scale. David's own engineering reports from the year before he retired had flagged the old bridge for age-related wear and recommended a comprehensive reinforcement and resurfacing within the decade. His estimated cost for that was under $3 million. There was no mention of structural failure, no hint of cut corners. His report was a model of fiscal responsibility and proactive maintenance. Richard had taken that report and twisted it into a doomsday prophecy. But the real shock came when I found the winning bid for the new construction. It wasn't the lowest bid. In fact, it was the highest, by a margin of nearly $4 million. The winner was a company I'd never heard of, Apex Development Group. The final approved budget wasn't $12 million. It was $22 million. An almost 100% cost overrun before a single shovel had hit the ground. The minutes noted that Councilman Sterling had championed the Apex bid, citing their superior materials and innovative techniques. It was all vague, laudatory nonsense. For 3 days, I lived at that record center. My diet consisted of vending machine coffee and the saltine crackers I kept in my purse. I pulled property records, business licenses, campaign finance disclosures. On the 4th day, I found it. Apex Development Group was an LLC, a limited liability company, which makes it hard to see who is behind it. But LLCs have to have a registered agent, a legal point of contact. The agent for Apex was a law firm in downtown Columbus, a big, expensive one. But the incorporation documents, filed 6 years ago, listed the original principals. There were 3 names. 2 of them meant nothing to me. The third was Marco Rossi, the disgraced contractor. The snake David had run out of town. He wasn't just in Richard's inner circle, he was the one building Richard's signature project. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a dark, ugly picture. This wasn't just slander. This was grand-scale municipal fraud. My next stop was my own basement. David had been a pack rat, but a meticulously organized one. He never threw away a notebook, a calculation sheet, or a daily planner. His entire 40-year career was documented in a series of neatly labeled file boxes. It took me 2 days of searching through dusty binders, the scent of old paper and graphite filling the air, but I finally found what I was looking for, his project files for the original State Street Bridge, from 1975. And tucked inside, I found his private journals from that year. David had used his journals to vent, to process, to think through problems. I flipped through the pages, his familiar, angular handwriting a comfort and a pang in my heart. Then I saw the name, Richard Sterling. In the early days, the entries were full of praise. "Rick is sharp," David wrote. "A real go-getter. Sees the big picture." But as the years went on, a different tone emerged. "Rick is more interested in the politics than the physics," one entry from 1988 read. "He knows how to flatter the council, how to get a project approved, but he's always looking for the easy way out." Then I found an entry from 12 years ago, long after Richard had left Public Works and been elected to the town council. It was an entry about Marco Rossi's substandard rebar. "Caught Rossi red-handed," David wrote. "Tried to bully me. Then he tried to bribe me. When that didn't work, he told me I didn't know who I was messing with. Said he had friends on the council." The next page was the one that made my blood run cold. "Had a visit from Rick today. He asked me to reconsider my report on Rossi. Said Rossi was a major campaign donor. Said blacklisting him would send the wrong message to the business community. He wanted me to bury it. To let it go. I told him to get the hell out of my office. I don't know who he is anymore. He is a man without a foundation. My husband, the man of integrity, had stood his ground. But he had never told me. I suppose he wanted to protect me from the ugliness of it, or perhaps he was ashamed of what his protégé had become. But now, it was all clear. Richard's betrayal wasn't recent. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to slander a dead man. It was the culmination of a decades-long rot. The Westerville Community Trust, the bridge, the lies, it was all part of the same monstrous design. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of my basement, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's honor and the proof of his protégé's treachery. The grief I had been nursing for 2 years was finally receding, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. Richard Sterling thought David's voice was silenced forever. But he was wrong. I had my husband's records. And I had a lifetime of experience in finding the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of lies. And I was going to enjoy pulling it all down, one brick at a time. The first thing I needed to do was find out where the money went. The $22 million for the bridge was public record, but the Westerville Community Trust was private. Our money. And I had a sickening feeling I knew exactly what that snake had done with it. To the outside world, Richard Sterling was untouchable. He was more than a councilman, he was Westerville's favorite son. He was a weekly fixture in the local paper, cutting ribbons for new businesses, kissing babies at the 4th of July parade, flipping pancakes at the Rotary Club breakfast. His face beamed from "Re-elect Sterling" signs on every other lawn. He had cultivated an image of unimpeachable public service, a man who had sacrificed a lucrative career in the private sector to work for the people. He drove a modest Ford sedan, lived in a respectable but not ostentatious house in the Highland subdivision, and spoke with a practiced, folksy humility that made people trust him instantly. He was a master of appearances, a walking, talking embodiment of small-town values. But I had seen the look he'd shared with Marco Rossi. I had read my husband's journals. I knew the truth was a different, far uglier animal. His power was woven into the very fabric of the town. He had placed his allies in key positions across the city government. The town manager owed his job to Richard's swing vote on the council. The head of the zoning commission was his former college roommate. He had a knack for making people feel indebted to him, for collecting loyalties like they were trading cards. Any attempt to question him publicly would be dismissed as the ramblings of a confused old woman. He would be magnanimous, of course. He would express his deep sympathy for poor Eleanor Vance, explaining how grief can make people see shadows where there are none. He would destroy my credibility with a gentle, pitying smile. I knew I couldn't fight him in the open, not yet. This couldn't be a frontal assault. It had to be a quiet siege. My first objective was the Westerville Community Trust. I called the number on the brochure Richard had given us. A polite, professional-sounding woman answered. I explained that I wanted a copy of the trust's latest financial statements. As an investor, I added, trying to keep my voice steady, I believe I'm entitled to them. There was a pause. Of course, Mrs. Vance, she said, her tone smooth as butter. We mail out an annual report every March. You should have received it. I'm afraid I've misplaced it, I lied. Could you send another? Certainly, she replied. I'll put it in the mail for you today. A week passed. Nothing came. I called again. This time, a different woman answered. She had no record of my previous request. She promised to send the report right away. Another week, another empty mailbox. It was a classic runaround, a bureaucratic stonewall designed to frustrate and exhaust you until you give up. They were counting on me giving up. So I changed tactics. I went back to my friends from the senior center, the other people who had invested in the trust. I started with Mary, a retired second-grade teacher and a notorious gossip. Over lukewarm tea in her chintz-filled living room, I didn't mention my suspicions. Instead, I feigned concern. Mary, I said, my voice trembling slightly, I'm getting a little worried. With the economy the way it is, I just want to be sure my money is safe. Have you seen a recent statement from the trust? I can't seem to find mine. Mary patted my hand. Oh, Eleanor, you don't need to worry about that. Richard is in charge. He's such a good man. I know, I said, but all the same, I'd feel better if I could just see the numbers. You know David, he always taught me to read the fine print. This resonated with her. All of our husbands had been men of that generation, cautious, practical men who trusted in ledgers and receipts. Over the next few days, I had the same conversation with a dozen other investors. None of them had received a financial statement in over a year. Some had tried calling and gotten the same runaround I did. But they had all dismissed it. Their faith in Richard Sterling was absolute. But my quiet questions planted a seed of doubt. A tiny, nagging seed. While that seed was germinating, I went back to the public record, this time looking at Marco Rossi. The man was a ghost in Westerville city records for the 10 years after David blacklisted him. Then, 6 years ago, just after Richard's second term on the council began, Rossi's name started popping up again. Not directly, but through a web of shell corporations and LLCs. Apex Development Group was just one of many. There was Cardinal Concrete, Buckeye Excavation, Scioto Properties. Each one had a different registered agent, a different mailing address, but they all had one thing in common: they were being awarded an astonishing number of non-bid contracts from the city. These were contracts just below the legal threshold that requires a public bidding process. Small jobs, mostly. Park maintenance, sidewalk repair, minor sewer work. Each contract on its own was insignificant, a few $1,000s here and there. But when I spent a week cross-referencing and adding them up, the total was staggering. Over the last 6 years, companies secretly controlled by Marco Rossi had been awarded over $3 million in non-bid contracts by the city of Westerville. And the councilman who signed off on the committee that approved these contracts? Richard Sterling. He was bleeding the town dry, one small cut at a time. The community trust, I was now certain, was the other side of the same coin. He was using our retirement money, our nest eggs, as his own private slush fund. He could move money from the trust into one of Rossi's companies for a community beautification project that never happened, and no one would be the wiser. It was a closed loop of fraud, with our life savings fueling the entire enterprise. Richard was so smug, so confident in his own cleverness, that he thought no one would ever connect the dots. He saw a town full of trusting, simple people and a handful of old folks who were too tired and too timid to ask questions. He was a wolf guarding the henhouse, and the farmer had just handed him the keys. The sheer arrogance of it left me breathless. It was one thing to slander my husband to cover his tracks. It was another thing entirely to systematically plunder the savings of the very people who trusted him most, the people whose hands he shook every Sunday at church. I was sitting at my kitchen table one night, surrounded by stacks of public documents, legal pads filled with my spidery handwriting connecting names and dates, when the phone rang. It was Mary. Her voice was thin, reedy with panic. "Eleanor," she whispered, "you were right to be worried. I needed some money to help my grandson with his college tuition. I called the trust to withdraw a small portion of my investment." She took a shaky breath. "They told me there's a 6-month hold on all withdrawals. Something about market volatility. Eleanor, that was my entire savings. What's going on?" The wall of faith was beginning to crack. The runaround wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was a cage. I looked down at the papers spread before me, the intricate web of deceit I had uncovered. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but it was accompanied by a surge of icy resolve. This was it. This was the turning point. He had hurt my friends. He had hurt the people David had spent his life trying to protect. He had made this personal, not just for me, but for all of us. Richard Sterling thought he was untouchable. He was about to find out that there is no fury like the patient, meticulous, and righteous anger of a retired librarian. He thought the story was over. But I was just getting to the good part. My kitchen table became my war room. For 45 years, my job had been to find information, to organize it, and to make it accessible. I had tracked down obscure historical texts for doctoral students and found patent filings for amateur inventors. This was no different. Richard Sterling was just a poorly indexed book filled with lies, and I was going to read every single page. The 6-month hold on the trust withdrawals was the key. It was a stalling tactic. It meant the money wasn't liquid. It was tied up somewhere, likely in Rossi's sham companies and the over-budget bridge project. It also meant Richard was feeling pressure. Something, or someone, was spooking him. He was building a fortress around our money, and I needed to find a way inside. Legal action was my first thought. I took my meticulously organized binder of evidence to a lawyer in Columbus, a man highly recommended for his work in financial fraud. He was a sharp man in a $1,000 suit. He listened patiently for an hour as I laid out the web of shell companies, non-bid contracts, and the suspicious circumstances around the community trust. When I was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice laced with a weary sort of pity, "this is a remarkable piece of research. Truly. But it's all circumstantial." He explained the legal hurdles. Proving that Richard Sterling personally profited would require subpoenas, bank records, and forensic accountants. Rossi's network of LLCs was designed specifically to obscure the flow of money. It could take years of litigation and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees with no guarantee of success. "And you'd be going up against the city's legal team," he concluded. "Councilman Sterling would paint you as a vindictive, confused old woman with a grudge. In a courtroom, that's a hard narrative to beat." "I'm sorry." I left his office on East Broad Street feeling deflated, but not defeated. He was right about the courtroom. I couldn't fight Richard on his turf. He controlled the lawyers, the courts, the narrative. A public battle would be suicide. So, I had to create a new battlefield, one of my own choosing. That evening, I hosted a book club meeting at my house. The only book on the agenda was Richard Sterling. Mary was there, along with 5 other women who had invested in the trust. They were scared. The story of the withdrawal freeze had spread through their phone calls like wildfire. I let their fear and anger fill the room for a while, then I calmly opened my binder on the dining room table. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through it. I showed them the town records, the corporate filings for Rossi's companies, the shocking number of non-bid contracts. I connected the dots from the massively over-budget bridge to their frozen retirement accounts. I didn't have to embellish or editorialize, the facts themselves were a brutal indictment. When I was done, the room was silent. The fear had been replaced by a hard, collective fury. These were not powerful women. They were retired teachers, nurses, secretaries. But they had raised families in this town, paid their taxes, and volunteered in their communities. They had earned their security, and Richard Sterling had stolen it from them with a smile and a handshake. "What are we going to do?" one of them finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at the faces around my table, frightened, determined, and underestimated. "We are going to give him the one thing he can't control," I said. "The truth. But we're going to do it on our terms. Not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion." Our conspiracy was born around that dining room table. We were 7 invisible women. We called ourselves the Westerville Widows Brigade, a little gallows humor to keep our spirits up. Our weapons weren't lawsuits, they were whispers, photocopiers, and the United States Postal Service. We started by pooling our money, not much, a few $100s, and renting a post office box under a fake name. That box became our headquarters. My role was the researcher. I spent my days digging deeper, finding more connections. I discovered that Rossi's company, Cardinal Concrete, the one that had received over $1 million in city contracts, was a phantom. The address listed on its business license was a dilapidated, empty warehouse down by the railroad tracks. I took pictures. I found proof that the superior materials Apex development used for the new bridge were actually sourced from a Chinese manufacturer with a history of safety violations and were significantly cheaper than the American-made steel quoted in the bid. I found the shipping manifests to prove it. The other women were my intelligence network. Mary, the gossip, was a natural. She learned from her hairstylist that Richard was putting a new, expensive addition on his house. Another woman, a former nurse, found out from a friend at the bank that Richard had recently paid off a substantial personal loan, despite his modest city council salary. They gathered stories, rumors, and grievances from every corner of Westerville. We learned we weren't the only ones he'd wronged. There was a small business owner who'd been squeezed out of a city contract by one of Rossi's fronts. A young family whose zoning variance had been inexplicably denied after they refused to donate to Sterling's campaign. Each story was a single thread. I wove them together into a tapestry of corruption. We began our anonymous campaign. We created a simple, one-page flyer. It didn't make wild accusations. It just asked questions. Did you know the State Street Bridge cost taxpayers $10 million more than the original budget? It asked. Did you know the primary contractor has been awarded over $3 million in non-bid city contracts? Asked Councilman Sterling why. We didn't list our names. At the bottom, it just said, concerned citizens of Westerville. We made thousands of copies at a Kinko's in the next town over. Then, in the dead of night, my little brigade of senior citizens fanned out across Westerville. We put flyers on windshields in the Kroger parking lot. We slipped them into mailboxes in the dead of night. We tucked them inside the free newspapers at coffee shops. It was a slow, quiet poison. At first, it was ignored. But we were persistent. Every week, a new flyer appeared. Each one revealed a new piece of the puzzle. We detailed the Phantom Concrete Company. We questioned the source of the bridge materials. We listed the other investors in the community trust whose funds were frozen. Slowly, the town began to whisper. People started asking questions at the grocery store, at the post office. The story was too detailed, too specific, to be dismissed as simple rumor. Richard's folksy charm started to look like a performance. His confident smile seemed a little more strained. He publicly addressed the anonymous, cowardly smears, dismissing them as politically motivated attacks from his opponents. But the denial was a little too forceful. He looked rattled. He had no idea where the attacks were coming from. He was fighting a ghost. And the ghost was getting bolder. Our final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. A man named Frank, a retired city accountant and one of the few men in our little group, had been quietly looking into the city's pension fund. He discovered that Richard had used his position on the council's finance committee to shift a portion of the city's pension investments into a high-risk, speculative fund managed by a cousin of Marco Rossi. He hadn't just stolen from us retirees, he had gambled with the retirement funds of every police officer, firefighter, and public servant in Westerville. This was the kill shot. This was the one thing that would turn the entire town against him. It was no longer about a handful of old widows, it was about the financial security of every family in the community. We had him. We had the documents, the proof, the whole sordid story. Now, we just had to choose the time and place for the execution. And I knew the perfect stage, the upcoming town hall meeting, the one where Councilman Sterling would be officially announcing his campaign for mayor of Westerville. He was planning a coronation. We were planning a revolution. The escalation was a quiet, creeping thing, like ivy growing over a wall. Our anonymous flyers had done their job. The whispers in Westerville had grown into a low, steady murmur of discontent. You could feel the shift in the town's atmosphere. Richard Sterling's name, once spoken with reverence, was now often followed by a questioning pause. His lawn signs seemed to wilt a little overnight. He was still powerful, still projecting an aura of calm control, but there were cracks in the facade. His public appearances became more scripted, his smiles a little tighter. He was a man hunting for an enemy he couldn't see. He had no idea the enemy was a group of 7 senior citizens operating out of my living room. Our war chest was still pitifully small, but our intelligence was priceless. The women in my group were a marvel. They were the invisible infrastructure of the town, the ones who ran the church bake sales, volunteered at the hospital, and remembered everyone's birthday. They heard everything. We learned that Richard had hired a private investigator to find the source of the flyers, a fact that gave us a grim, satisfying thrill. We became even more careful, using pay-as-you-go burner phones for our communications and paying for our Kinko's copies in cash. We were a suburban spy ring, fueled by Sanka and a burning sense of injustice. The closer we got to the mayoral announcement, the more frantic his actions became. We heard through the town grapevine that he'd strong-armed the local paper, the Westerville News, and Public Opinion, into killing a story a young reporter was writing about the bridge's cost overruns. The reporter was promptly reassigned to covering high school sports. Richard was plugging leaks, shoring up his defenses. The linchpin of our plan was the pension fund. Frank, our retired accountant, had obtained a copy of the investment portfolio through a friend who still worked for the city. It was worse than we thought. The fund Richard had moved the money into wasn't just high risk, it was a disaster. It had lost nearly 40% of its value in the last year. He had taken the secure retirement of hundreds of city workers and betted on a failing horse run by his crony's cousin. It was reckless, it was arrogant, and it was, according to Frank, almost certainly illegal. It was a breach of his fiduciary duty on a scale that was impossible to ignore. We knew this was the information that would finally detonate the bomb we had so carefully built. But a photocopied investment statement on a flyer wasn't enough. People needed to see the truth from a source they couldn't dismiss. I thought about going to the state authorities, to the Attorney General's office in Columbus. But that would be slow. It would get bogged down in bureaucracy, and Richard would have time to cover his tracks, to spin the narrative, to paint himself as a victim of a complex market, not a corrupt politician. No, the unmasking had to be public. It had to be sudden. It had to be a spectacle he couldn't control. It had to happen in his moment of triumph. The town hall meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday night at the Westerville Community Center. The agenda was packed, a classic Richard Sterling strategy to bore residents into leaving before the important votes. But at the end of the night, under new business, was his big moment, his official announcement that he was running for mayor. The local news crews would be there. It was his launch pad. Our plan was simple, and it relied on perfect timing. We prepared a package. Inside a plain manila envelope was everything: copies of Rossi's phantom business licenses, the photos of the empty warehouse, the shipping manifests for the substandard Chinese steel, the list of our frozen trust accounts, and front and center, the pension fund's disastrous investment statement, highlighted and annotated by Frank. We made 10 of these packages. 1 for every member of the town council, 1 for the town manager, and 3 for the news reporters we knew would be there from the Columbus stations, channels 4, 6, and 10. The delivery system would be my brigade. The women would disperse themselves throughout the audience, looking like any other concerned citizens. They would each have an envelope. At the precise moment I gave the signal, they would move. My job was the most dangerous. I had to be the one to light the fuse. I requested a 3-minute speaking slot during the public comment portion of the meeting, which was scheduled just before new business. I registered under my own name, Eleanor Vance. My presence on the list would be a curiosity, nothing more. They would assume I was there to say a few words about the bridge named after my husband, to thank the council. Richard would likely see it as a touching, serendipitous endorsement just minutes before his big announcement. The arrogance of the man was his greatest weakness, and I was going to use it to hang him. The night before the meeting, the 7 of us gathered one last time at my house. The mood was tense, electric. We went over the plan again and again. We synchronized our cheap plastic watches. As soon as Eleanor says the words public trust, I instructed them, you get up and you hand out the envelopes. Don't say a word. Just put them in their hands and then fade back into the crowd. We were all scared. We were ordinary people about to do something extraordinary. We were about to publicly confront the most powerful man in our town. He had the money, the connections, the law on his side. We had the truth. We prayed it would be enough. As they left my house that night, each woman clutching her secret package, Mary pulled me aside. Her eyes were shining with a mixture of fear and excitement. David would be so proud of you, Eleanor, she whispered. I squeezed her hand. Let's just hope we don't end up in jail, I replied with a wry smile. But in my heart, I knew David would be there with me. This fight was for his memory, for his legacy of integrity. It was the last promise I could keep for him. The stage was set. The players were in position. and the curtain was about to rise on Richard Sterling's final act. The Westerville Community Center gymnasium was packed. The air was stuffy and thick with the smell of stale coffee and civic duty. Bright lights for the television cameras from WCMH and the other Columbus stations cast a harsh glare over the proceedings. The town council sat on a raised dais at the front of the room, looking bored and important. In the center, looking regal and confident, was Richard Sterling. He wore his favorite navy blue suit, a red power tie, and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He scanned the crowd, occasionally giving a little wave or a nod to a supporter. When his eyes passed over me, sitting in the third row, he gave me a special smile, one filled with patronizing warmth. It was the smile of a man who thought he had me completely under his thumb, a sweet old widow who would serve as a perfect prop in his political theater. It took every ounce of my self-control not to glare back. Instead, I gave him a small, tremulous smile in return. Let him think I was frail. Let him think I was harmless. The surprise would be that much sweeter. The meeting dragged on, just as we knew it would. There was a tedious presentation on sewer line maintenance, a contentious debate about rezoning a parcel of land for a new strip mall, and a lengthy award ceremony for a retiring city employee. My brigade was scattered throughout the audience, 7 gray-haired ladies looking for all the world like they were just there for the free cookies. I could feel their nervous energy from across the room. Every few minutes, one of them would catch my eye, and I'd give a subtle, reassuring nod. The public comment period was last before new business. My heart began to pound a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Next speaker, the council president droned, is Eleanor Vance. I felt 100 pairs of eyes turn towards me as I walked slowly to the podium in the center of the room. My legs felt shaky, but I gripped the sides of the lectern to steady myself. I looked out at the crowd, then up at the council, and finally, I let my gaze rest on Richard Sterling. He was beaming, leaning forward in his chair, anticipating a gentle, heartfelt thank you. I cleared my throat. The microphone screeched for a second, and I flinched. Good evening, I began, my voice surprisingly steady. My name is Eleanor Vance. My late husband, David Vance, served this town as an engineer for 40 years. I saw Richard nod encouragingly. He loved Westerville. He believed in this community. He believed that holding a position of power was not a privilege, but a responsibility. He believed in the sacred nature of the public trust. That was the signal. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw them move. Mary, Helen, Susan, all 7 of them, rising from their seats with a quiet, synchronized grace. They moved down the aisles, their manila envelopes held in front of them. People in the audience craned their necks, murmuring with confusion. The council members looked bewildered. Richard's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. My women reached the front of the room. They walked up to the dais and placed an envelope in front of each council member. They handed envelopes to the stunned reporters sitting in the press section. Then, just as planned, they turned and walked back to their seats, melting back into the crowd. It took less than 30 seconds. It was a silent, perfectly executed coup. I turned my attention back to Richard. The mask was gone. His face was a storm of confusion and dawning horror as he tore open his envelope. Mr. Sterling, I continued, my voice rising in volume and strength, you named a bridge after my husband. You stood at a podium and used his good name to peddle a lie that he cut corners on the old bridge. But the truth is, the only corners being cut are by you. A collective gasp went through the room. The reporters were frantically flipping through the documents. I saw one of them, a young woman from Channel 6, her eyes going wide as she read the pension fund statement. You told us the new bridge was for our safety, I said, my voice ringing with 45 years of librarian-trained authority. But these documents show you gave a $22 million contract to a company owned by Marco Rossi, a contractor my husband had blacklisted for using substandard materials. You did this to justify a budget that was nearly double the original estimate. Richard shot to his feet. This is an outrage, he sputtered. This is slander. Mrs. Vance is a grieving widow, she's clearly confused. I am not confused, I shot back, my voice like a whip. I am a citizen of this town, and I have a question for my councilman. I would like to know about the Westerville Community Trust, Mr. Sterling. The trust where you convinced me, and dozens of my friends, to invest our life savings. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. I could see the faces of my fellow investors, people who had been too scared to speak up, now looking on with a mixture of terror and hope. You told us it was for community beautification. But our funds are now frozen. Can you tell us, Mr. Sterling, if our retirement money was funneled into Mr. Rossi's phantom company, Cardinal Concrete, the one whose address is a derelict warehouse? All color had drained from Richard's face. He was looking wildly from me to the other council members, who were staring, mouths agape, at the papers in front of them. The news cameras, which had been passively recording, now swiveled to focus tightly on his face, zooming in on every bead of sweat. And finally, I said, delivering the killing blow, I'd like to ask you about the city's pension fund. A dead silence fell over the gymnasium. This was no longer just about me or my friends. I had their complete, undivided attention. These documents show that you, as head of the Finance Committee, moved millions of dollars from the city's stable pension fund into a high-risk speculative fund managed by Marco Rossi's cousin. A fund that has lost 40% of its value. You didn't just steal from a few retirees, Mr. Sterling. You gambled with the future of every teacher, firefighter, and police officer in this town. It was over. The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing. The other council members were backing their chairs away from him as if he were contagious. The reporters were on their feet, yelling questions. Richard Sterling stood alone at the dais, trapped in the glare of the television lights, his face a mask of utter ruin. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at me, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a sort of shocked disbelief. He couldn't comprehend how it had all fallen apart. He was looking at a 69-year-old widow in a cardigan sweater, and seeing the architect of his damnation. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused him of a crime. I had simply asked questions and provided the answers. I let the truth do the work. I picked up my handbag, turned my back on the chaos, and walked calmly out of the room. The aftermath was a swift and brutal avalanche. The story was the lead on every late-night news broadcast in Columbus. The next morning, the front page of the Columbus Dispatch had a picture of Richard's horrified face, caught in the camera's glare, under the headline, Westerville Councilman Accused of Fraud, Embezzlement. The State Attorney General's office launched a full-scale investigation that very day. The FBI got involved, looking into the interstate commerce violations related to the Chinese steel. It turned out our little binder of evidence was just the tip of a very large and very dirty iceberg. Richard Sterling's empire of deceit, so carefully constructed over decades, crumbled to dust in less than a week. His allies on the council, the town manager, the zoning commissioner, they all turned on him, scrambling to save their own skins, offering up testimony in exchange for immunity. Marco Rossi was arrested trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands at John Glenn Columbus International Airport. He sang like a canary, detailing years of kickbacks, bribes, and money laundering schemes, all orchestrated by Richard. Richard, of course, resigned from the town council immediately, citing health reasons. It didn't help. A month later, a grand jury indicted him on 27 counts, including racketeering, mail fraud, and money laundering. His mayoral campaign was replaced by a legal defense fund. The trial was a formality. Our documents, combined with Rossi's testimony and the forensic accounting trail uncovered by the FBI, buried him. They proved that the Westerville Community Trust had been nothing more than a personal slush fund, used to finance his lavish lifestyle and pay off his cronies. The pension fund losses were catastrophic, and he was found to have received a six-figure finder's fee for moving the money into his cousin-in-law's doomed fund. He had betrayed every single person he had ever sworn to serve. I attended the sentencing at the federal courthouse in downtown Columbus. I sat in the back, just another anonymous face in the gallery. My brigade was there, too, scattered throughout the room. We never publicly took credit for what we'd done. To the world, the scandal broke because of an anonymous tip. No one ever knew about the late-night flyer drops or the meetings around my dining room table. We let them think the system had worked, that justice had prevailed on its own. It was better that way. Richard stood before the judge, a shrunken, diminished figure. His expensive suit hung on him. His face was gray and haggard. The swaggering, confident politician was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified man. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. As they led him away in handcuffs, his eyes swept the courtroom, and for a fleeting moment, they met mine. There was no anger in them. Only a hollow, empty recognition. He finally knew who had beaten him. The town of Westerville slowly began to heal. The bridge, a monument to Richard's corruption, is still called the David Vance Memorial Bridge. At first, I wanted them to change it. But then I realized it was fitting. People now knew the truth. They knew that David's name stood for the integrity that had been violated, and his memory was the catalyst that brought the truth to light. His legacy wasn't just the bridges he built, but the quiet, unshakable foundation of honesty he'd left behind. The community trust funds were mostly gone, a hard lesson for me and my friends. But the town, shamed into action, set up a restitution fund, and we eventually got most of our money back. It was never about the money, though. It was about the truth. It was about reclaiming my husband's name. Sometimes I walk over that bridge. I run my hand along the cold bronze of the plaque that bears his name. The cars rush by, and life goes on. Most people have forgotten the scandal, the drama of that town hall meeting. They've moved on. But I remember. I remember the look on Richard's face, the satisfying collapse of his world built on lies. Vengeance, I've learned, is not always a fiery, passionate thing. Sometimes it's cold, and slow, and meticulously researched. I kept one of our anonymous flyers, the very first one, tucked away in my husband's old journal. It sits there, pressed between the pages where he first wrote about the man without a foundation. The end.